Saturn doesn't want us to give up our dreams, only to make them real. This is a quote from the astrologer Stephen Forrest. Today I'm going to talk about a much feared, much dreaded Saturn transit. No, it's not the Saturn return. It's called the Sade Sati. This is a 7.5-year period of Saturn's transit to the sign before, the entire sign of, and the sign after your natal moon sign. And I am in the last 2.5 months of my Sade Sati, which is why it felt a pretty good time to talk about my own experience through the Sade Sati. I'm also going to address notable figures and what went on, some very pivotal moments in their life during their Sade Sati, and how we can have remedies for Sade Sati. So if you're about to approach this, or if you're in it right now, you can remove fear and hopefully get more of the strengths from the period. My name is Molly. I am a professional astrologer. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. And if you're interested in a personalized reading, which I always recommend that you consult with an astrologer, even if it's not me, just because these are very general videos, but as you'll see in some of the examples, whether Sade Sati is more challenging or can be very bring you a lot of recognition will really depend on how the moon and how Saturn are in your natal chart, along with other factors like the transits and the Mahadasha you're in. So I'd be happy to work with you, and you can check out classes, retreats, other things on my website, radiantguidance.com. I will link it in the description. So without further ado, let's talk about Saturn. Saturn, if we look at his glyph here, is kind of the antithesis of Jupiter. In the Vedic cosmology, Saturn is considered all about limitation, time, karma, scarcity, doubt, fear, endings too, very much finality, right? So it's natural that humans fear Saturn. They consider Saturn to be the strongest planet within the solar system because of how powerful his effects can be. And if we think of our Saturn return, it's a very formative time period. It can be challenging, but it can really, through that crises or that feeling of constriction or, dang, my time is running out, we actually really get aligned to our paths. So Saturn can take away. He can make us feel less resourced. He can put pressure on relationships. And these are all things, isolation, are things people can experience during their Sade Sati. Now, if you're like me and you have a Capricorn moon in the Vedic system, even if you have a late degree Capricorn moon in the tropical or Western zodiac, you are at the end of your Sade Sati. It would also include people with a Western early to mid Aquarius moon, or most of the Aquarius sign in Western astrology. If you have an Aquarius moon, you're ending your Sade Sati as well. If you have a Pisces or Aries moon, you're about to be entering your Sade Sati, so this video should be very informative. I'm going to talk about my own experience being a Capricorn moon Saturn person with my moon and Saturn in the 10th house of my horoscope. So in my Sade Sati, I've been working very hard building my astrology wisdom, knowledge, and business. And I would say that most of my Sade Sati, this has been a big focus of my life. I did have 2 long-term relationships during my Sade Sati that did not work out. And I'm just trying to take a breath here, so much to say. And that's pretty classic, actually. They say that it can be a tough time on relationships. And it doesn't mean if you are already partnered, married, whatever, that if you're about to enter your Sade Sati, it's going to end. But it's good to know you're going through this period because it might bring just more pressures or more challenges to your personal relationships. And in Vedic, I believe they even suggest not getting married during the Sade Sati. Again, that's pretty extreme, but just take it with a grain of salt. I would say I experienced a lot of feeling like I am paddling upstream. I feel so connected to my path and my passion of astrology, but I experienced a lot of doubt or external people making me doubt that as like a career or a vocation. Many people would say, you should just do it as a hobby, or that's not really a real job, is it? You know, that kind of stuff. And so it doesn't surprise me because Sade Sati will kind of test our grit. And I think what Saturn really can teach us is that even if we're not reaping, right? His glyph again is the sickle that kind of reaps a harvest. Even if we're not reaping that harvest in that moment, by developing that grit and persevering and persisting, we actually are gaining a lot, even if the outer circumstances aren't always showing us that or like rewarding that, because Saturn might take stuff away temporarily and or permanently, right? He can take stuff away permanently too, and we can feel, wow, I don't have as much resources, but ultimately it's developing grit. A great example of someone who went through a lot of challenge during his Sade Sati and it really strengthened him as a person is Keanu Reeves. So I'm going to pull up his chart here, and in the outer wheel, it'll have his beginning of his Sade Sati. The date I actually picked is the date he lost his then wife, Jennifer Saimi, in a very tragic accident. And it happens to be really shortly after Saturn entered the sign before his moon sign. So this was the very beginning of his Sade Sati. Now he came to mind to research because everyone always talks about how Keanu has all this terrible luck. But really in recent years, he's not really been in the news for that or known for that. And so it didn't surprise me as an astrologer that he was basically going through a Sade Sati when a lot of his bouts of bad luck were taking place. So one of his quotes I'm going to pull up here. He's known to kind of be a Saturnian type, not just for his acting style and roles and kind of having that stoicness to him, but he has a humility about him, and I feel like that's what Saturn can do. It can bring humility. If we look at his natal chart, he's got Saturn in the sign of Aquarius. It's Saturn's own sign. Saturn rules the signs of both Aquarius and Capricorn in classical astrology. So he has that, he's got a strong Saturn, you know, he can tap into that resilience probably more easily than others. And he has a quote saying that every struggle in your life has shaped you into the person you are today. Learn to appreciate the hard times. They can only make you stronger. I really love this quote because that's exactly kind of the summation of what Saturn wants to teach us. Now, he lost tragically his wife in an accident during Sade Sati. She was actually in her Saturn return when she passed. And it's, you know, very heavy stuff. And he kind of illustrates that, you know, Saturn is like lead. It's the heaviest element, one of them. And, you know, if we can actually learn to like push, like strengthen through that lead weighting down on us, we get very, very strong. And sooner or later, such as in his life, you know, the wheel of time will shift things back in your favor again. He's obviously been partnered since then, and his life has gone on, and he's had other kind of successes in his life. So just know that you can get through it. And I really like his quote. And just so you know, not all these examples are going to be so heavy. Some of them, while they might have important lessons, the people that went through the Sade Sati got great recognition during them. So the next one I'm going to talk about is another more challenging Sade Sati, and this is the Sade Sati of the musician Pete Best. You're probably like, who is that? Pete Best is known as one of the unluckiest musicians of all time. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but he was in his Sade Sati when he was essentially let go from the Beatles. I have his chart here, and then we have the outer transits of the day that Ringo Starr essentially replaced him. Now, he was a drummer in the Beatles, and they let him go because they felt like he wasn't really performing up to par, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, Sade Sati can be a period where we're not feeling the most vital or the most optimistic. The moon is our mind, the moon is our emotions, and Saturn influencing that can really bring a lot of doubt and a lot of inner criticism, I would say, inner judgment, and kind of that like harsh voice that can come out. So he was let go, and then just a few weeks later, they released Love Me Do, which topped the US charts and really parlayed the Beatles into fame. So it wasn't so much that he was just let go, it was that he was let go right before the Beatles really blew up. So it was very unlucky timing. Now, he was in a dasha of Rahu, Mahadasha, K2 subdasha, and so that can be a dasha that really strips one of like material desires. So I don't know what was going on in his own internal process during that time, but I'm sure he can look back and we can kind of objectively look back that that was a pretty unlucky series of events, at least at the time. But again, he might not have been so concerned with that material aspect of life, of fame and wealth and riches. So another example I'm going to give is a more uplifting example of a Sade Sati. This is someone who actually really peaked and really entered their recognition during their Sade Sati. I don't want to say they peaked, let's say it was the moment that began their reputation. And this is the chart of Oprah Winfrey. So in the center, we have Oprah's chart. The outer wheel is the transits. And it was literally the peak of her Sade Sati when Saturn is 1 degree approaching her moon sign. That, that would be the peak. When Saturn goes into the sign after, it's kind of like the wave is crashing, right? It's disseminating. So when she was in the peak, the Oprah Winfrey Show was released. Now, I did read a lot of her biography, and in 1985, while she was in the Sade Sati, she did have like a questionable relationship with someone who was a drug addict, and there were kind of talks about her having used drugs like with that partner, and so it was obviously like not a great influence. And that can be the thing, like maybe you're not picking the best partners in the Sade Sati, but obviously she came out on top because during the peak of her Sade Sati, Oprah Winfrey Show's released, and she has a platform, and she became a billionaire in her Sade Sati. Or sorry, a millionaire. I don't think she was a billionaire yet. She's a billionaire today, but she was a millionaire in the 80s. So a very, very interesting formative year. Now, why would Oprah's Sade Sati be a little easier? I think it was also had to do with her Saturn is very strongly placed in her chart. She has an 11th house Saturn. That's Saturn in the house of wishes, gains, and it's a fame house, you could say, the 11th house. And so it's wishes granted. And so her luck kind of was on her side in her Sade Sati, and she also happened to be in a Venus Mahadasha and a Venus Subdasha. And so it really brought her those Venusian things. And I believe she also ended up partnering with her now husband, who she's been with for a very long time in her Sade Sati. So it's a great example of how if you meet someone on Sade Sati, it's not to say it's doomed at all. In her case, that relationship was very, very prominent and important. The next example I'm going to give is I was looking at his chart for just different reasons. I was looking at his chart to like look at his dashas and time periods, and I happened to notice this Sade Sati. So this is the chart of Nicolas Cage, a really great performer, and he kind of has a reputation for performing in really intense roles, like pretty heavy roles, and he actually won an Academy Award for Leaving Las Vegas, where he essentially goes to Las Vegas to drink himself to death, and before, gamble all his money and spend it on hookers. It's a depressing movie. I remember watching that movie and feeling pretty bad for a little period after. I was like, whoa, what did I just see? It's kind of like watching a train wreck. Anyways, I would say he really he's another kind of Saturnian type. He has Saturn pretty, well placed in his chart in Capricorn. And so he kind of gets Saturn. So even when Saturn dealt him a difficult card, he handled it with grace. So it's really interesting because he was in his Jupiter Dasha when he won his Academy Award for his performance in Leaving Las Vegas. And so he's in this kind of Jupiterian period. And during that time, he amassed properties. At one point, he bought an octopus. He bought a dinosaur skull that he had to end up having to return to the government of Mongolia because it was stolen. So he was rolling in it, some pretty out there purchases. And It was during Sade Sati, as we can see in his chart here. The date was for when the IRS essentially came to him and was like, you owe 14 million in taxes, like back tax stuff. And he blames it on his poor business manager skills, and he ultimately paid it back. You know, good for him. He never actually had to go bankrupt because, again, I think his Saturn Capricorn like got him through, but I'm sure that was a pretty stressful time. And the reason I discovered his Sade Sati is because there was a period where he was taking just like any old role, and it was like he had his heyday in the 90s during his Jupiter Dasha, and then during his Sade Sati, and he was also in a, I think he was also in a Saturn Dasha. He was in these like movies that never got released, and they were crummy movies. He admits that they were crummy movies, and he just took those roles because he really needed to pay off his debt. But I really love this quote, and we can see when that announcement came, he was in the peak of his Sade Sati. But his quote is great. He says, "Work was always my guardian angel. It may not have been blue chip, but it was still work. Even if the movie ultimately is crummy, they know that I'm not phoning it in, that I care every time." So he never lowered his standards of the energy he brought his work, even when it was movies that maybe other actors wouldn't be proud of or weren't very glamorous or prestigious roles. He still gave it his all. And to me, that is what Saturn is asking us in the Sade Sati. He's like, don't give up, keep going. Saturn wants you to persist. And ultimately, the grit that you develop when the checks aren't rolling in as much, or you're feeling less resourced, or you're not getting the same amount of recognition, ultimately you're developing that integrity, right? And the rewards, when they do come, you will really appreciate them more and perhaps not squander them. So I'm sure when he balanced out his checkbook again, he wasn't making those like extravagant purchases as he was in the 90s. So let's get into the final piece where I'm going to talk about remedies. So the number one remedy for working with Saturn periods is mantra. You can get gems, you can do fancier, more costly remedies, but mantra is the simplest. And I'm going to put a video out on mantra to talk about that more in depth and why I started really devoting myself to a mantra practice. But the idea is that we are attuning ourselves to the frequencies of that planet. We are attuning our energetic bodies to the planet, and by changing the inside, we can change the outside and the external circumstances and how we meet them. We're better resourced, we're better equipped. So work with a Saturn mantra, and I'll link some below in the description, but you can even specify it to the nakshatra that your moon is in, like the mantra, working with mantras of your moon to support your moon during this time as well. Also, the HANUMAN CHALISA is a well-known mantra that any old person can really benefit from HANUMAN CHALISA, but particularly people in their Saturn return or their Saturn Sade Sati, because he helps us overcome challenges. And Hanuman is a protector energy. It just so happened that I met someone during my Sade Sati, and they happened to be, I don't think they were in their Sade Sati, but they were in their Rahu period, like myself, which can also bring about extremes. And they introduced me to the Hanuman Chalisa. And so I really don't feel like it was an accident, because I later found out that the Hanuman Chalisa is a remedy for Sade Sati. And so especially if you do it on Saturdays in the evening before bed, but ideally just carve out 10 minutes a day to do a mantra. Ideally, Hanuman Chalisa, you can recite the full thing once, and people will be sticklers about you need to pronounce everything right. But honestly, just try, and there's so many recordings and resources of proper pronunciation. And if you email me, actually, I have a really good Saturn mantra resource, so I can share that with you. So email me directly. And it's not linked on YouTube, so I can't just link it below. I will include it as an attachment. But yeah, the idea is that you do it consistently and you do it with intent and devotion, because we don't want to just like half-ass listen to a mantra or not recite it 108 times. The key is, if you can't do it 108 times, at least do it 9. The key is the consistency, the duration. Just like we wouldn't take a medicine a few times a week and then hope in a month is gonna support our body. It's really about the consistency. So hopefully this is helpful to you. If you guys like this content or have your own Saturn Sade Sati stories, please share below. I would love to hear what you learned in your Sade Sati, what challenges came up, what gifts you got out of your Sade Sati, even better. So I appreciate your support on this channel. Have a blessed day.